So we're going to talk about building Nuxt 3 applications today powered by Notion. I'm excited about this because I get to talk about two of my favorite things, being Vue and Nuxt is one of them. Notion is another. I use Notion for like everything, kind of powers my life because I'm a little bit of an organization freak. Like I need things organized to be able to accomplish things. So big fan of Notion. And today I want to talk to you about kind of putting those two together. My name is Dan Vega. If you don't know anything about me, you can head over to danvega.dev. I'm a husband and a father. They're actually going to be part of our story today. I'm going to tell a little story and how I got into kind of putting these two technologies together. We live outside of Cleveland, Ohio. I have been a software developer for over 22 years, and I hate putting that on slides because it makes me feel a little bit old. But it also means that I've had a chance to kind of do a lot of things in this industry. I've worn a lot of hats. I've been on the front end, the back end, curriculum development, developer advocacy, and that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I am a Spring developer, so I am wearing my fancy Spring developer polo today. And Spring is a framework in Java that sits on top of Java. So I am the Java developer at a JavaScript conference. No, I did not get lost. I know where I am. But I really enjoy doing that. I enjoy creating content. So I found early on in my career that something I was really passionate about was learning new things and then being able to teach them back to others. And that's why I love, making YouTube videos. I have a YouTube channel. I write a newsletter. I write blog posts. I get to come to conferences and talk about whatever excites me, which is really awesome. And I feel very grateful for that. I'm over on the Bird app, whatever we're calling it these days, at The Real Dan Vega if you want to follow me. So what are we going to cover here today? And actually, I think I just, is that not right? Let me just flip that. No, doesn't want to do that. Sorry. That's okay. Cool. All right, what are we going to cover today? We are going to talk about Nuxt and Notion. How do we get here? I'm going to tell a little story and kind of how I put these two technologies together. We'll talk about Notion itself. Like if you've never heard of Notion, what is Notion? What can we do with it? We'll talk about Nuxt, why I love Nuxt, some of my favorite features in Nuxt. And then finally, we'll talk about like how do we put those two technologies together and put them into a usable app. And I'm talking about a real app that I deployed into production. So let's talk a little bit about story time. I want to talk about kind of how these two kind of technologies came up for me and how I put them together. So this is my family, my beautiful wife, Jen, our two daughters, Isabella and Juliana. And yes, I did want a reason to show off my little girls. They are adorable. But no, this is actually part of my story. So my wife, Jen, she's an English major. And, when we decided to have kids, she really wanted to be able to stay home with the kids. This was something she was very passionate about. She wanted to kind of put her career on pause and stay home with the kids. And this was great. We felt very fortunate to be able to do this. But throughout the years, this was also, we had two little kids during COVID, and now, the oldest one is almost 6. I noticed something, and I think this is an important job if you're ever married and you want to have kids. You have to be able, as a spouse, recognize some things in the other person that they don't recognize. And I saw my wife kind of really pouring herself into being a mom, and that's all she was. My whole entire life is being a mom now, taking care of the kids. And I think, being able to recognize that, like, you still are a person. There are still things that, like, you are interested in. And so it was kind of my job to notice that. And I noticed that, like, okay, she's kind of drifting away from doing the things she likes to do and just kind of being a mom. So I got Husband of the Year award last year for Christmas. I ended up buying her a new laptop because she didn't have a laptop. She was writing all her notes on her phone. And she's an English major. She's always really enjoyed writing. She picked up a Kindle. She was like reading all these books again. And I kind of really saw a passion in her. And so by recommendation, I picked up this book called On Writing. And this was really funny because when I gave it to her, she was like, I'm not a Stephen King fan. I've never read one of Stephen King's books. Why are you giving me this book? And I said it came really highly recommended. So fast forward, she read through the book. She loved the book. So if you have anybody in your, in your network who enjoys writing or wants to get into writing, this is a really great book, even if they're not a Stephen King fan. So she went through this book. She got to the point where she's like, yeah, I want to start writing more. So what's a way that I can consistently start writing? And, we started throwing around the idea of a blog as like a first kind of avenue into that. And so she wanted to do this as a way to kind of help others. So that's a really great reason to get into blogging, to help others. That's kind of how I did it in my career. But she also wanted to she wanted to help others who were in her position, being a mom, how to raise kids, things that she came across every day. Because when you leave the hospital with a baby, your first inclination is, wait, the nurses aren't coming with us? That was my first thought. I was like, wait a minute, we have to go do this ourselves? So her idea was to kind of help other moms out there and put a blog together. The second one was really a memoir for her kids, like being able to talk about all these memories that we had and a place to journal them, and so that one day they could kind of read through them. So this got us thinking, let's start a blog, right? She started coming up with some ideas for a name, and she came up with This Is My Momwar, kind of like a memoir before moms. And she came up with a domain name, and I went out, registered the domain name. We got all the social media handles, and we were able to kind of get this going. So then we started thinking, okay, this is going to happen. We need to build this out, right? I was really excited about this until I started getting all of the ideas from her. She said, oh, here are 20 blogs that I really like. Or, here's how this thing is going to look, and I really like this look and feel. And I was like, oh, I just went from helping her out to having a full-time client as a part-time job now, right? This is going to be a lot. So I was starting to get a little overwhelmed. In fact, I was like, oh, I'm suddenly regretting this, right? Now I've just gone from helping out to I am fully entrenched in this, and this is going to be a lot. So I thought it was a good idea. Now I feel like I've made a mistake, right? But now I'm in it. I can't do anything about it. I booked a session with my therapist, and after this, I was able to calm down a little bit. After I calmed down, okay, I said, all right, I need to take a good approach to this. How am I going to build this out? How are we going to build this application, right? So I started thinking about some of the different ways that we could put this together without, it being super complicated. And I started thinking about the different ways that I might build a blog application today. So Nuxt content is out there. I'm a big Vue and Nuxt fan, so it probably had to be in that world because I need to use something that I'm familiar with. Nuxt is great. Nuxt content made easy for Vue developers. This Nuxt content, you can basically create a content folder, write a whole bunch of files in Markdown, and produce this really nice content-driven website. This is great. This is great for me because I'm a developer and I like Markdown, but I don't know if this is going to work for her, right? She doesn't. I think anybody outside the developer network doesn't really understand Markdown or care for it, and I understand that. But even with Nuxt content, this is great. I rewrote my entire website in Nuxt content, so if you want to check that out, danvega.dev, you can see an example of that in the wild. And then I started thinking about WordPress. WordPress is a big blogging template or blogging engine. Maybe we could use that. Then I remembered I used WordPress probably 5 or 6 years ago to run my blog because I got to the point where I was tired of managing themes and functionality, and I just wanted to write. So I put my application, my blog on WordPress, and I remember it being, first off, I'm not a PHP developer, so knowing that all of these things, these customizations that my wife wanted to make, I was like, I'm not going to be able to do this in WordPress without either hiring somebody or Googling forever, or asking ChatGPT. So this was going to be very hard to do. Also, I think and I know this is wrong to say because WordPress runs something like 40% of the internet. But for me, content-driven websites, there's a lot in WordPress that kind of slow it down, right? There's all these plugins you got to put in, and then you got to figure out and I feel just for a simple content-driven website, you can have some performance issues there. So at that point, I was like, all right, I'm not going to use Nuxt content. I'm not going to use WordPress. What if I just use Nuxt? I can write Nuxt, right? I can use Vue and Nuxt. I can, somehow create a place where she can write these things, and then I can pull them in. And then, that kind of lends to something like a CMS. So you can reach out to, there are plenty of really great headless CMS options out there, probably some of them here at the conference this week. So I thought maybe I could just talk to a headless CMS, pull that content down. And then I started thinking about well, is that a great authoring experience? Like, it's okay if you need to like edit some content, right, for somebody who doesn't know HTML and they need a place to edit content. But is it a good writing experience? And I kept thinking about that, and I said, no, probably not. Then there's Nuxt Studio. So this is pretty recent. This is the Nuxt Studio is a Git-based CMS powered by Nuxt content. This is great. I'm really excited about this. In fact, I may look into this for my website. But again, this is Git-based with Markdown. This probably isn't going to help her out. So I started running through all of these options, and I came to the point where I was like, okay, we have a problem. I don't know what to do here. I don't know how I'm going to build this thing the way that I want to, right? And I said, oh, wait a minute. The problem is me. I'm the problem. Because this whole time I'm thinking about, like, how am I going to do this so that it makes me happy, right? And that it makes me in a place where building this thing out is going to be fun and enjoyable. So after I kind of reset there, nice quote from our friend Captain Jack Sparrow, the problem is not the problem is your attitude about the problem, right? So I had to kind of reset and go, well, I'm thinking about it from my standpoint. What about thinking it from, her standpoint? Talking about, like, we are developers, we're here to solve problems, maybe not the way that we want to solve them, but we need to solve the problem first. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, let's start with the author in this standpoint, aka my wife, and figure out, like, how she might want to write these blog posts or these articles, and then kind of work backwards from there, right? So I sat down with my wife. I said, how do you like to write whenever you're writing? And before that laptop, she did a lot in her notes tab on her phone. She would just sit there on the couch while we're having family time and do a lot of writing on the phone. She said, I also like Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word is something I'm familiar with. I said, okay, maybe not that, but that can translate to something like Google Docs, right? Also she's heard of Scrivener, which in the writing community is a really great way to kind of organize your thoughts. And if you're ever writing a book, it seems like a really great tool to do. But the more I started getting into this, I said, okay, again, I need you to have a good authoring experience, but I also need to make this reality, right? Like, I can't be having you send me Microsoft Word docs, copying that content and putting it into some kind of website somewhere. So I said, this is not going to work. We need to come up with a better solution than this. So I'm a big fan of Notion. So Notion, I use it a lot. I told you at the beginning, I use it for everything in my life, keeping track of everything I do, whether it's personal or professional. I write all of my blog posts in there, even though I enjoy Markdown. I enjoy being in Notion because it's kind of distraction-free. There's a mobile app, there's a desktop app. You can kind of update things on the go. I write all my newsletters in there, and everything that I do from content creation standpoint, I do in Notion. So I sat down with her and I said, hey, is this tool something that you might be interested in? Because I knew they had an API, I could get stuff out of there. So she went down, started going down that road. I kind of built her out just like a quick prototype of a database that include for blog posts. And I think the one thing she really enjoyed was we had like this Kanban board style, where it's like, let me write a bunch of ideas. So here's an idea for a post, 1, 2, and 3. And now let me take this post over and put it into, I'm currently working on it. She can go through and kind of put her ideas down. And then when you put it in like a completed state, now we would pull all of those blog posts into Nuxt. So this seemed to work. So we had a good authoring experience for the author. I had a good technical thing here, a technical tool to use because it has an API. I could pull it in. So we seem like we have a go. So let's talk about, real quick, just Notion in general. Is everybody familiar with Notion? A couple? Okay, cool. So it's hard to explain Notion to people because it is like one of those tools that can do everything. And it says here, Notion is a connected workspace where better, faster work happens. Now with AI, because we can't sell anything these days without that AI involved. But that AI is actually pretty good. So Notion is just a tool that I use to kind of organize everything. You saw some examples of that earlier. You can go sign up for free today. There is a paid plan that doesn't give you a whole lot more, at least from the standpoint of what we're talking about today. I have a paid plan, but everything we're talking about today can be done on the free plan. So what are some features of Notion that I really enjoy? So here we are on a page. I really enjoy Notion's text editor. Again, you can get into kind of a distraction-free mode, start writing. You can use all kinds of content objects. So you can put in headings, paragraphs, images, tables, videos, etc. What I really enjoy as compared to something like Markdown is I get much better like grammar checking, spell checking. I can have comments, so if I want someone to come in and kind of collaborate with me, they can put comments in here and say, hey, this first paragraph needs some updating, right? This is really customized for you or your team, so you can have a bunch of team members on it. I think one of the best things about Notion is it's so customizable. One of the worst things about Notion is it's so customizable because I like to be given a starting point, but there's no starting point. They just drop you into a blank space and say, customize it to however you want it to be. And that can sometimes be a little bit frightening, but once you get used to it, I really enjoy the fact that you can kind of customize anything in there. There's a Notion web clipper, so I write a newsletter every week. One thing I really enjoy is the web clipper. I might be reading an article and I say, hey, I want to talk about that. So I just hit the web clipper and save it into a particular database or page. There are templates, so any page that is basically public and can be duplicated can be a template. We'll talk more about templates in a second. And then Notion AI. And I joked, but the Notion AI is a little bit, I think that's extra, so you got to pay like $10 a month or something. But there's some really great features in there, and I use it for like writing my newsletter. I go in and say, hey, here's this particular block of text that I just wrote. Can you check for spelling and grammar mistakes? Can you improve this writing? And sometimes I get some really good suggestions back. So some of the AI features in there are really nice and even good with like, hey, I just wrote this blog post. Can you write a summary? So I have a summary at the bottom of a blog post kind of talking about what it was. Or can you write kind of a description or like a title for it? So there's some really good stuff as far as AI goes. So how does Notion work? Everything starts in a workspace. Once you signed up for Notion, you're dropped into this workspace. It's your workspace. You can add people to it, but this is your workspace. Everything in Notion really is driven from database and pages. So the idea of a database is just a way to kind of collect and store your content, the same way that you use a database today. Inside a database, we may have pages. So you can think of a database as a collection of blog posts. A page could be like one particular blog post. Again, we talked about Notion templates. There is actually a really big Notion template gallery out there, so you can go get some from them. There's also user-created templates, some of which are free, some of which are paid. And again, anything that is public and can be duplicated is a template. Back to my newsletter, I kind of use this format. I create a template so that every week when I say I'm going to start a new one, you could do this for a blog post too. Here's the format of this particular thing that I'm writing. So another really great thing to have inside of Notion. Also, if you go to the GitHub, we'll look at that a little bit later, there is a link for what we're doing today with the blog post in the exact same format that I have in the code. So if you want to duplicate that template, you can use it in a sample project to get up and running. Cool, so we go in, we create a new database. So everything, again, in Notion starts with a database. You can have different views of a database. I usually start with a table, but you may have one particular database represented 10 different ways because there are different views like Kanban boards and calendars and galleries and a whole bunch of other things. So you start with a database. In this case, it's a Kanban board view driven by status. So the status is a to-do, in progress, and complete. So again, to-do is that area where I can say, hey, let me just start to work on some ideas. As I begin kind of fleshing them out, I'll throw that in progress. So I'll start writing there. And then once I move it over to complete, I'm saying, hey, this is now published. I want you to go ahead and put this out on the web. So this is kind of the basic structure for our database. Inside the database, you create a new page in Notion. That page can have a bunch of different properties. These are properties that you can define on your own. These are the ones I have. I'm saying, hey, I want a date created and a date updated. I want an image for like a cover image. I want a section, so I'm going to have different categories in this particular website. And I'm going to have a slug, which represents this unique blog post. So now I have a page with properties. This is kind of the finished product. We have a bunch of things in to do. On that left is her workspace. She only has this one thing. You can favorite it in the upper right. So once you have a lot of content in here, you can have just the things that you care about the most up top. But this is it. There's a whole bunch of things that are still in to-do, a whole bunch of things that are still being worked on, and then a whole bunch of things that are completed. The ones in the completed column are what we're ultimately going to pull onto the live website. Cool. So we know about Notion. Now we need to talk about the Notion API, because just because something has an API doesn't mean it's going to exactly give you everything you need, right? So we need to kind of explore the API. So the first place to check this out is at the Notion docs. So if you go over to developers.notion.com, you can read through their getting started, some examples there. There's the API reference, so if you can start to dig through the API and understand what's available there. And then there's some also mention of the SDK, which we'll talk about in a bit. So there's an integration section. This is where when you create a new integration, you're saying, hey, I want to create an API key, and this API key is going to allow me to access information in Notion. So there's one on there called Momware Test. So I have a test database that I'm using so that I'm not talking to the live one, and this is basically an API key. Inside that integration, you can define all kinds of capabilities, like, is this just read access? Can I create? Can I update and delete? Do I have access to things like comments? Do I have access to things like user information? This is where you can kind of define what that integration is going to look like. Then, back in the database, you can click on those three dots in the upper right-hand corner. You can go down and you can click Add Connection and search for that integration that you just created. Now you are saying, hey, this database has access to that particular integration that I created. Now that that integration is created, the kind of tying the two together, now that API key is going to work for talking to this database. So, working with databases. If you go into the documentation, you'll see some information about the different APIs available to you. Your first inclination might be, well, I just want to retrieve a database. I just want to get some information about a particular database, like all the blog posts. And that's what I thought too, but you'll end up using querying a database a lot more because it has options for like filtering and sorting. And most of the time, you're probably going to want to filter or sort on a database. In our example, I want only everything that has been completed, and I want to sort by date descending, right? So the query for a database, if you want to look in the documentation, that's a really good place to start. This will probably be a little hard to read, but this is an example in Postman of calling that API. It dumps out a list of results, and these are all the pages within the blog post database. So it's in JSON format. We have all these pages. It's important to note that the pages are just like the pages. They're not the actual page content. It's not the blog post itself. It's just the metadata about the page. So what do I mean by that? So when we create a new page, we have this title. We have all these fields that we created, these properties. So when was it created? What is the cover image? Those are the page properties. So when we get a list of pages from the database, those are the pages with those page properties, not the page content. So that is important to understand. So if we get the page with the page properties, how do we get the content? So we have some APIs here for working with pages. Again, that get call for retrieve a page will give you exactly what you need with the properties. It just spits out a bunch of information there, so it gives you information about each of the pages. So how do I get the content? This is where modeling content as blocks come in. So every page's content is represented by a list of block objects. And this is like a huge array of all the things that you put in a page. So I have a paragraph, I have an image, I have a video, another paragraph. This is really an array of block objects, and those block objects represent content. So each block could be, like I said, heading, paragraph, image. They'll have common properties to each of them. So what is the object type? So that could be paragraph, heading, image. When was it created? Last edited. Does that object have any children? Because you have to like iterate over that to get all those. So it's not just, you can't just call an API and say, for this page, give me the HTML that I need. You're going to get all of this kind of raw content that you need to deal with somehow. And there's, again, probably hard to see, but the other thing that really tripped me up is working with files and media. So this could be an image, it could be a video. Whenever you go into the UI in Notion and say add a new image, these are going to be externally hosted. So this is going to be on S3. This will be hosted on AWS, and users can upload images through the UI. The thing that gets me here is that all media types are referenced by a public URL that points to where this file is stored. So if you look down at line 25, if you can see it, there's a link to Amazon AWS where this file is stored. The other part about this is there's an expiry time. So I just updated this screenshot yesterday, but the image actually expires 1 hour after it's been created. I still have not gotten a good answer from Notion side on why they do this. Probably some kind of security, I'm not sure. But basically, if you upload an image, it will basically expire every hour, and they'll give you a new path to a new image. So this makes statically generating your site nearly impossible, because if you upload an image and pull that content down and reference that file, that thing's going to change at some point. And so that's something to really keep in mind. That kind of tripped me up to begin with. I still haven't found a good solution there. You could probably do something where you're reading the content, checking the image, maybe build, in a build step, you move them to an image folder, and now you're just referencing them locally. But I still use this, but now in Nuxt, there's a way to basically say, hey, invalidate the cache every 60 minutes and make sure next time it's refreshed, it goes out and gets the new one. But this is just something to make sure you understand, because it caught me for a while there. I just found this image on Twitter. I was literally, sitting there in Eric's presentation, and I was like, can I use that? I'll give you credit. And he was like, yes. I thought this was really cool. I want to talk a little bit about Nuxt and some of the things that I find interesting in Nuxt, and then we'll kind of connect the two. So some really cool, really great graphic here, kind of describing the landscape of Nuxt. And I just want to give a shout out to this person on Twitter. Like I said, just asked him an hour ago, and he said I could use it. So cool, Nuxt3. I love being a part of this community, the Vue community, the Nuxt community. It's just one of those communities I love being in. Nuxt is getting really popular. They put this tweet out earlier this month and said Nuxt3 was downloaded 1 million times in September. That's pretty cool to see. And Nuxt is just one of those things that I feel like every time I need to do something in Nuxt, there's always an answer for it. So hey, I was just building my blog. I need a way to generate an RSS feed. There's a module for that. I need a way to create some nice SEO titles and descriptions and metadata. There's a way to do that. So big fan of Nuxt. I'm just going to talk through a couple of those features that I like. The file system routing. So when you're dropped into a project, it's pretty minimal. And I like that. I don't like to be taken into this massive project where there's 20,000 folders. I like starting with that minimal approach, and then as I need things, I can start to add to it. So that file system routing says I can create a folder called pages, and then every view file that I put in there is going to create a route. This is great. There's some great data fetching capabilities, because in Nuxt, we're not only dealing with the client, we're also dealing with the server. So there's some composables that allow us to kind of use that on both the client and the server side. Auto imports are really interesting, and I find myself using them outside of Nuxt in just plain Vue applications. You ever get dropped into a component and see 30 lines of imports and just go, ugh, this is not how I want to start my day, right? I feel like that kind of takes away from what I want to do. So I know you can, in some editors, you can kind of collapse that stuff, but auto imports allow you to say, hey, all the components in my components folder, or all the composables, or all the stuff that comes out of Vue, like ref and reactive and watch, we don't need to import those because they're auto imported for us. So I really enjoy that, not having to figure out where imports are coming from. Composables, reusable logic in Vue, modules. There's just a really great module ecosystem there. Again, anything I need to do, I usually can find a module or a plugin for. That SEO and meta tag support is very important especially when you're launching something like a content-driven website. .env support right out of the box is really nice. If you create a .env file, you can put your keys in there. That's not going to get committed to Git. You can override those in whatever environment you're going to. I often use a .env and then a .env local. In this instance, I did that. So envia is going to end up pointing to the production website, .env local. I'm using a different API key and a different Notion database that just talks to like a temporary one that I can kind of mess around with. So I really enjoy that. And then you could do pretty cool things with transitions. I'm a big TypeScript fan. I'm a Java developer, so I like types. I like all the kind of things that come with it, as far as like the IDE experience and IntelliSense and refactoring and all those things that you get out of TypeScript. I'm a big fan of. Now, I started using TypeScript a few years ago, but never like really dived into it. I am kind of new to it in the fact that like now I'm starting to use it as much as I can. And there are things that you'll run into that kind of make you scratch your head, but once you get past those, I think it's wonderful. Now, it's written in TypeScript with TypeScript support out of the box, but it does not force you into TypeScript. So if you don't want to use TypeScript, you don't have to, which I think is really great. I don't know why that one's there. Let's real live coding debug that. All right. And then there is Nuxt Nitro. So when they rewrote it from the ground up, they kind of took a look at their server implementation and said, we need a different approach to this. So they created a whole new server implementation called Nitro. And Nitro is actually open sourced. If you want to use it in your project outside of Nuxt, you can. There are many features here. I'm not going to read through them all, but one of the ones that we're going to talk about today are the API route support. So you can go into a server API folder, create a new JavaScript or TypeScript file, and you basically get a server route. So now from your front end, you can call a server back end there, and this is going to play crucial into what we're doing here today. So one of the other things is the Nuxt DevTools. If you haven't had a chance to look at this, this is just hit 1.0. So if you create a new application by default now, it will be installed by default. I don't know if it's turned off, but the configuration is there. So if you enable it, in the lower left-hand corner, you get this nice little widget that you can pop up over your site. And it has all these like really cool features. There's a really good talk from Anthony Fu, who works on this at Nuxt Nation just last week. So if you want to learn more about DevTools, I'll just talk about one thing that I really enjoy. We talked about some of that SEO and the metadata stuff. That is really important for content-driven websites. They have a feature in Nuxt DevTools where you can go in and see what the SEO metadata is going to look like. So if you have like a Twitter card or an OG, like the Open Graph cards, most of the time I would always like publish those sites and then go look to see how they look when they're in production. Now you can actually like in the DevTools like see what they're going to look like, what those cards are going to look like. And it will also examine all of those properties and go, hey, we noticed you're missing the Open Graph ones. You have Twitter ones, but the Open Graph ones are missing. And so it will generate it'll tell you which ones are missing, and then generate the code for you to go ahead and copy and put back in your application. So there are a whole bunch of great tools in the DevTools, and if you're using a Nuxt site, I suggest taking a look at that. All right, so that's Nuxt, that's Notion. Let's kind of put these two things together. So the first thing that we might want to do is get a list of blog posts, right? If we build out an application, we need to get a list of all the blog posts that are completed. How do we do that? So I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new Nuxt app using npx nuxi at latest init. I'm going to call it blog. You're going to pick whatever your package manager is. In this case, I picked npm, whether or not you want to initialize a Git repo, and it brings you here and it says, hey, if you want to, go ahead and cd into blog and npm run dev. So this is just a brand new Nuxt application. So my first inclination would be, okay, I know there's a REST API. I know I have an API key. Let me just go into app.view, because that's kind of the place where everything happens. That's our entry point to our application, right? Let me go in there and make a REST call to the Notion API. Does anybody know what might be wrong with this? No? So when you make a call from just a View app to a REST API, that secret that we have embedded in there is now going to be made public. So anybody can catch that secret. So this is a big no-no. In fact, if you try to do this, Notion will basically come back with an error and say, this is a bad request. because there's no cores enabled on the Notion side of the REST API because it doesn't want you doing this. So this was my first inclination. Like, let me try this, and then I was, oh yeah, now I remember, we probably shouldn't do this. And I like that it's kind of safeguarding us from doing this. So if I can't do it in my app.view, where am I going to do it? Again, we have Nuxt Nitro, which allows us to create these API routes in our server directory. So in server/API, you could start there, but I created a Notion folder, and again, this could be TypeScript or JavaScript. You're basically creating an endpoint. So now anywhere in my app on the client, I could call /API/Notion, and this is what gets invoked. So in here, I'm using the same code that was in app.view. I just put it in here. I'm making a fetch call out to the Notion API for a particular database. You can see there's like a random database ID on there, and I'm doing a query against that. So I pass in my secret, and one of the other things I really love about these API endpoints is in some of the languages, frameworks, you have to like construct what is going to be returned, what is the body, what is the response. Here I'm just returning posts. That's the object I want to return. The Nitro server engine kind of handles all of that for me, and I like the simplicity of that. So if this is my endpoint from the app.view now, I can go in and say, hey, go ahead and give me the data. I'm going to await something. I'm using the use fetch composable that is built in the Nuxt. Here's the route I want you to call. That's the server route that we just set up. And if I do that, I can log the data. What comes back from use fetch, you can get like data and error and pending and some other things. So I'm destructuring that to just get the data out. And if I log the data out, here's all the data for that call. So we were able to make a call to our API endpoint that we created that now calls the Notion API, which now, by the way, because it's on the server, we're not exposing that API key, which is a very, that's a big point. When we get the call back, we get all of this data. Now I said, I think one of the things that really kind of made me scratch my head when I started this is just the way that all of this data is constructed in Notion. Because it's so customizable, you can get so much data back. In this case, if I'm looking at that results array and looking at that 01, there's an ID. What is the object type? This is a page. Here are all the properties of that page. Here's the URL. There's a whole bunch of data that comes back. And so this can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but don't worry. TypeScript and types are going to help us. So the problem with that call is we were just making a regular fetch, right? A regular REST call. There's actually an SDK for Notion for JavaScript, and this is much easier than making your own REST calls. It gives us a bunch of things out of the box, like, hey, I need an easy-to-use API. Once I create a new instance of a client, let me call databases, let me call pages, let me, an easy API to work with. It gives us logging, error handling. Most importantly for me, it gives us TypeScript types out of the box. So when we get a response back, I know exactly what that response is going to have in it. I don't need to go like console logging that entire object and trying to figure out what is in there. I have a type. I know what's going to be in that response. So there's also some type guards in there to say, hey, there's a bunch of like unions in the type. So hey, if this thing comes back as a union, I need it to narrow down to this specific type. And there are also some utility functions in there. So how do you get started with this? In that same Nuxt project that we are in, now you could say npm install @notionhq/client. So now we have this new client library. That's a little hard to read, but basically we can say now, create a new client. On line 4, I'm saying Notion is equal to new client, and I'm passing in my auth. I've hard-coded my secret in here, but normally this is going to be something that comes from an environment variable. And now I could say notion.databases.query. And query, if you remember back from the API docs, that's one of the things the API does, right? I pass in a database ID. This is the thing I want to contact. And then I pass in a couple options. One is filter. Hey, I want to get only the ones where the status is done. And I want to go ahead and sort it by date created descending. From that, database.results will have all the results, so all the blog posts. I can just transform each of those results into a post. So how does that work? Now that I have types, I understand exactly what information is coming back. So if I look at this query database response type, I can see that results is an array of, and this is a union, so there are different types in there, one of which that I care about is the page object response. This is going to have all the details about the page coming back. So now I can go ahead and use those database results and transform them into posts using the map method, map function, right? Now because that is a union coming back in TypeScript, it could be one of 4 different things. I use a filter function here to basically say, hey, I want to make sure that I know what's coming back as a page. It could be one of those 4, but I know exactly what that is. So go ahead and expect it to be of type page object response. So now I set my ID, my title, my slug, and my cover. That's all I care about right now, and I can return those posts. So I have a blog page where I can list out in app.view, I'm listing all of my blog posts out. Now I need a way to get just a single blog post, right? So we have the listing, let me get a single one. How can I do that? The way that I can do that is define this new route. So we had one route before, we're introducing a second route. And this is at server/API/Notion/ and then slug is in brackets. So slug is saying that this is going to be a dynamic variable, and we need to get this somehow. The way that we get that in this case is by the event. We could say, hey, from the context, go ahead and get the request parameter called slug. So we can get the slug. We have our Notion client. We can say, hey, go ahead and give me, I'm still using that same method I did before, but this time when I query, I'm passing a different filter. I'm saying, hey, filter all those results by the property slug, and if the slug matches, go ahead and return that result. Then also what I'm doing here is saying, hey, if there is no results, I want to throw an error, right? If somebody's looking for a particular blog post that doesn't exist, Nuxt has some really great error handling built in. So I'm saying, hey, throw create error. The status code is 404. This post was not found. Here's the slug. And I found this to be incredibly useful, not only to the user, so the user gets redirected to this page that says, hey, something went wrong. But one of the things that are new to me, at least on the front-end side, right, is observability. Like I need a way to find out like what's going wrong, when it's going wrong. So I started using Sentry, and because this thing is throwing an error, Sentry's picking that up. So anytime somebody goes to a blog post that doesn't exist, that is showing up in my logging, and I'm able to see what's going on. So between Nuxt and Vue, I really enjoy some, at least that for the error handling there. So we have a way to get a particular blog post. If it does exist, I create a new route on the front end. Again, this is kind of a catch-all route. It says that .slug is a dynamic variable, saying, hey, anything after wherever this sits, I think it's in blog, anything after that is the slug. So in Nuxt, there is a use route composable. It says, hey, from the route, go ahead and give me the request parameters and grab the slug for me. So now I can say await fetch. And remember, we just created a new endpoint for /API/Notion and then the slug. So if I make that call, I will get the post back. The post will contain the title and then the content. Now, remember, we've been talking through this. The content is not just the HTML or the Markdown. It is going to be that block, those blocks that represent the content in Notion. And so then our question is, well, how do we get from this to something like the content? So talking about displaying content, if you go into one of these blog posts that you write on Notion, there is, if you go hit the 3 little dots in the upper right, if you go down, there's a way to export these as Markdown. So that was my initial thought, because I actually use this on my own newsletter because I haven't automated everything yet. I write in here, I just export it as Markdown, and I actually pull that into my Nuxt content. I know I really should automate this at some point, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But you can export all this content out as Markdown. Unfortunately, the API does not have this feature. You can't just call the API and say, give me the HTML or give me the Markdown. So there's no way to do that from the API. But if we look at the post type, also I want to mention, if you're in Nuxt, you may be tempted in your different server routes to, if you're using TypeScript, to go ahead and create different types and different files. But in Nuxt, if you go under the types folder, create an index.ts, you can go ahead and export these globally. So now they can be used in any of your routes, any of your files that you want. So that's where I define all of those. So I define a type called post. That post has something called content on it. Those contents are an array of block object response. And again, those blocks are the different content blocks. So how do I go from those content blocks to something that's readable to the user? So there's a whole bunch going on here, but at the top, we're basically saying, give me the information for this post. And then if I drill into this a little bit farther on line 17, there's something called a block renderer. So the block renderer iterates over each block and passes that as a prop to this block renderer component. So how do we go from that to this? Well, in the block renderer, you'll see that there's a component line on 31 that says this is a dynamic component in Vue. Does anybody use dynamic components? Cool, so you guys know about them. All right, so this is where the kind of magic happens. That is a special prop that is going to say, hey, I'm going to use whatever component you pass into me. So every one of those blocks has a type. The type is, if you look in that current block declaration there, the type is either heading underscore 1, 2, 3, paragraph, image, video, quote. These are all the things that I'm supporting in this particular app. There are a whole bunch more content types, but I didn't go through and write components for all of those. I just wrote components for the ones that I wanted to support. So take paragraph, for instance. If one of those block types is a paragraph, it'll say, go use the paragraph component to figure out how to display this information. What does the paragraph component look like? It just brings that in as a prop. So it's a prop of type paragraph block object response. Again, TypeScript really helping us to understand what that type is going to include. And then I just go through and take a look at it and go, what do I want to do with this paragraph? I ended up creating a paragraph, a p tag, and then at the end of the day, I'm just kind of outputting the paragraph as HTML. So we're really kind of iterating over all of those blocks, deciding out how we want to handle that content and using it. Now, this may seem like a pain to you, and it was to begin with. Here's the good news. You don't have to do this. You can just grab this code and use it right away. So you don't have to go through kind of some of the struggles that I went through. Now, you will if you want anything outside of those types that I support right now, but this should be enough to get you going. So we've built our application and we want to launch it into the world. Production is the greatest place on the internet, right? That's where we all want to get to. That's the goal here. So how do we do that with Nuxt? Nuxt has some really good rendering modes. As I talked about earlier, something new to Nuxt 3, there used to be a way to do universal rendering, which is the default. There's client-side rendering, but there's also hybrid rendering. We don't have enough time to kind of go through what each of these are, but if you head over to the docs under concepts and under rendering, there's a really great documentation on what each of these are, what are the pros and cons of each. The one that's out of the box is universal rendering, so it works on both the client and the server, and they do some nifty things to make this happen. But what hybrid rendering is, in Nuxt 2, it was all or nothing. Like, you have to pick one or the other. Now in Nuxt 3, you could say, hey, for this particular route, I want to use universal rendering. For this particular route, I want you to statically generate it because it's never going to change. So think of things like an about page or a privacy page or disclaimer page. Those could all be pre-rendered. I don't need to, those don't need to be hydrated every time, right? I can just go ahead and statically generate those. While the rest of these have some dynamic content to them, now we can kind of define some rules on those too. We can say, hey, in the example of this one with the Notion images, I could say, hey, every 60 minutes I need you to put that cache header in there and revalidate, because if I don't, I'm gonna have a website full of blank images, right? So rendering modes are really cool and really help you kind of get into production. Here's an example from the documentation. on how you could render different routes or use different render rules for different routes. So on the home page, I'm saying pre-render is true. That means statically generate that. On products, I'm saying, hey, this is generated on demand, and it will revalidate in the background. Now that SWR, ISR, you could set to a number as well. You could say, hey, like I did, every 60 minutes, I want you to revalidate. You can also do cores and then some redirects. So these route rules are really configurable and really great in Nuxt. Deployment, because of those options, you can deploy your apps as a Node.js server, pre-rendered for static hosting. You can even do things like serverless or edge deployment. There's a whole bunch of really great hosting options. I just took this out of the documentation, but I'm a big fan of Netlify. I know Netlify and Vercel are big. Netlify I use for a lot of sites, and I just always have like a really great experience with them. So they are one of the supported providers out of the box. So there is a GitHub repo. So if you want to take a look at this, Dan Vega, so github.com/Dan Vega. This is my Mamor. Again, that's the blog that we worked through. This is public, and if you look on there, there's the template for the blog posts that we went through. So if you want to duplicate that exactly and then kind of use your own integration with this code, you can. More importantly, all those components that we talked about, the block renderer, all the components for like outputting a paragraph, a video, an image, etc., those are in there as well. And so I do want to just quickly show this since I have time. So this is kind of the final result. And again, one of the things that I said at the beginning was she was telling me, this is how I want it to look. These are the photos. She literally told me, we're going to have photo shoots to take pictures for the website. And yes, we had a photo shoot, and this is one of the photos we ended up taking. So this is how it ended up. And actually, I might be running into, okay, so here's like, these are different components. This is the home component, and I have a newsletter component. Here on the home page, I'm saying, hey, output all of the categories. And then for each of the categories, I'm saying, hey, go grab the latest 3 blog posts in that category. Again, that's the same query that we were looking at before. You can call the Notion query and say filter out by something. In this case, I'm filtering by the section and saying, hey, only give me 3 of them. Here's the, and order them by date descending. So that's a way to kind of get like the latest posts. So I have all these latest posts. If you go into a particular category, like let's go to travel, on every category has like a header with a cover image. Then I have the latest post. So if we go to Hilton Head, then you can see the content there. Again, I'm not the greatest designer, so this is the best I could come up with. But this is using Tailwind underneath the hood too. There's a nice Tailwind module for Nuxt 3. You just install it. It gives you everything out of the box, and you're up and running. There's no configuring, but you can always like override some things to kind of extend Tailwind. So here's the content. Again, these are all different block objects that we just kind of iterate over. And then we have things like images in here. We have, there's me on a bike. I'm a big golfer too. This is overlooking Harbor Town. The harbor, this is a really cool golf course there. Yeah, so this is kind of outputting that content. And I think I'll just show, again, from a component standpoint, if you look in components, I have separated these into like, these are blog components, these are Notion components. So these are the ones that I kind of support out of the box. Here's that block renderer that we looked at earlier. So here's that dynamic component that will kind of switch between those. Here's all of those different components. Like what a heading 1 doesn't really need to do much. Just needs to output that content. But it's never, if you start digging into the API, it's never like a heading 1 is just a piece of text. There's all this like markup around it because you can customize it so much. Like if you wanted to allow the writer to put some colors on there, there'll be some colors, or is it bold, or is it this? And you have to like kind of take all of that information and figure out how you want to output that on the component. So in this case, I just grabbed the plain text. I'm just saying, hey, this is a heading 1. Here's the plain text. I'm outputting it. Again, some things. One thing that I didn't get to do with this yet is it's not using Nuxt image. Nuxt image is really awesome. But it works, Nuxt image usually works with like local images. So I'm doing that on my personal website. I'm not doing it here. But that's one thing I want to look at doing is adding Nuxt image in here because we could probably get some better support if we use something like that. So yeah, not much to it. If you go under pages, there's a few static pages. There's the blog has, hey, I want to go ahead and list out everything by its category, or I want to go ahead and list it out by slug. So that's the single blog post. And then if we look at the Nuxt config, here's our routing rules for that. Again, on the home page, I do have some of that dynamic content. So those blog posts have images, and I can't just statically render that. Because if I did, those image URLs would expire, and then I get a bunch of blank images on the page. In fact, I'm still having issues with that. I'm still trying to figure out what's going on there. But here's my solution is every 60 minutes, put in that cache header. Hopefully it revalidates and goes out and grabs the new image. So I'm doing that for the blog as well, but then all the other static pages, I'm saying, hey, go ahead and pre-render this. This is a static page. It's not going to change. Then if you wanted to update it, you need to rebuild it locally and push it and then do a build on it. And that's how that changes. And again, yeah, I think, again, with like Vue and Nuxt and this kind of workflow for me, I love the fact that I make changes locally, I test them out, I push them to Git, it builds on Nullify, everything's live. So it's a really nice workflow for me. Cool. Some resources. So if you want to get into Notion, there's one really great YouTube channel called Thomas Franks Explains. He does a great job of kind of talking through all of the features in Notion. Whenever anything comes out that's new, he jumps through it. I really love that YouTube channel. The Nuxt documentation, I heard Sebastian say last week that one of the things he really wants to improve is the documentation. And I'm sure there's always room for improvement, but I think it's really one of the best docs out there. I like how there's a getting started section, and then everything is kind of based on directory structure. So if you don't know what's in the pages directory, you go to the pages section in the documentation, and it says this is what it's used for, and this is how it works. And so I really enjoy the Nuxt documentation. There's a great course out there called Mastering Nuxt with the Nuxt team and Michael Thiessen. They do a great job of kind of going through all the features of Nuxt. I also did a little YouTube video series with the Net Ninja on building a portfolio with Nuxt content. So if you're interested in that, that's out there. And then for Vue and Nuxt, Vue Mastery, Vue School, those are two really great resources. Cool, so that's it. danvega.dev if you want to learn more. My social links are on there, but they're also up here. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have. Thanks. That was a lot. Any questions? One question. All right.
Any other limitations you found working with the Notion API to populate your blog post?
No, just really, I haven't found a good way to solve for the media because I would rather have those media files local, but then like how do we know when they're updated? So I could do a build step where it says if I don't have that file, go ahead and pull that image down, transfer it over to public images, and now I have all those locally. But how can I figure out when that media file's change? So I haven't figured that out yet, but as soon as I do, I think that'll go into the build step of like, what images are missing? Go ahead and put them locally. Now I can use things like Nuxt image. I can use, like with video files, I could use, instead of iframing stuff, there are some progressive enhancement ways to like display YouTube videos. So there are some performance things that we need to fix, but other than that, it's been great. Like I said, the biggest hurdle was trying to like take all of those objects and output them as like HTML. So that's the hardest part, but you can grab that code and do it right now.
I'll just say what you're talking about with Nuxt image. You can set external domains that Nuxt image is allowed to fetch the images from.
Yeah, so I thought, and I just don't know enough about Nuxt image because I've used it with like the local files. I swear I've tried that, but again, it's something with like that external URL changing all the time where I would just go to the page and just be blank images. And so that's the hurdle that I'm trying to run. That's the biggest hurdle I found so far.
Is static site generation.
Yes.
And that would let you at build time fetch all those.
Exactly. Then I can just, because there's nothing dynamic there. I mean, there doesn't need to be. So yeah, I'd rather just statically statically generate the whole site, and now that's a much better performance out of the box. So I will be there. All right, I will be there. Cool. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it.